December 9, 1946, 9:42 in the morning. The wooden doors of courtroom 600 at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, Germany, swung open with deliberate precision. 23 Nazi doctors entered in single file, their footsteps echoing against marble floors that had once witnessed the pageantry of Nazi rallies but now served a different purpose entirely. These were not the propagandists or camp commandants who had faced trial months earlier. These were physicians, men who held medical degrees from universities like Heidelberg, Munich, and Berlin. Men who had sworn the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. Men who had transformed medicine into murder. At the head of the procession walked Dr. Karl Brandt, 42 years old, Adolf Hitler's personal physician, and Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation. His white coat had been exchanged for a dark suit, but his bearing remained that of a man accustomed to authority. Behind him came Dr. Siegfried Handloser, chief of the Wehrmacht Medical Service, a decorated officer whose career spanned both world wars. 21 others followed, their faces displaying expressions ranging from defiance to resignation, but all sharing one assumption, that their medical credentials would shield them from the full weight of justice. They believed their science, however twisted, would provide immunity from prosecution. They were wrong. The courtroom itself had been transformed by American efficiency into a temple of accountability. For judges sat elevated behind the bench, Americans appointed by the United States military government in Germany. There were no representatives from other allied nations in this tribunal. This was an American court, applying American law to crimes so unprecedented that new legal frameworks had to be created to address them. The lead prosecutor, Brigadier General Telford Taylor, stood at a table piled with documents 3 feet high. Each page represented a victim, an experiment, a crime that the defendants believed they could justify through scientific language and military necessity. The defendants took their seats in 2 rows, arranged not by rank, but by the nature of their crimes. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who had conducted sulfanilamide experiments on Polish women at Ravensbruck concentration camp, sat beside Dr. Waldemar Hoven, who had murdered prisoners through phenol injections directly into their hearts. Dr. Kurt Blom, who had researched biological warfare using human subjects, sat next to Dr. Hermann Becker-Frasing, who had forced prisoners to drink seawater to study dehydration. Each man represented a specific violation of human dignity. Each believed he had acted within the bounds of legitimate medical research. General Taylor rose to deliver the opening statement. His voice, amplified through the courtroom sound system installed by American engineers, carried the weight of moral certainty. The 23 defendants before this tribunal are charged with crimes so heinous and so unparalleled that no legal precedent exists to judge them. They are doctors who conducted experiments without consent, who inflicted suffering without purpose, who murdered thousands in the name of science. They transformed healing into torture, medicine into murder, and human beings into experimental materials. Today, American justice will hold them accountable. The doctors sat unmoved, some taking notes, others conferring with their defense attorneys. They had prepared extensive justifications. Military necessity demanded rapid development of treatments for battlefield injuries. Hypothermia experiments on prisoners would save German pilots shot down over the North Sea. High-altitude tests would improve Luftwaffe performance. Sterilization research would prevent the spread of inferior genetics. Each argument had been rehearsed. Each defense crafted to transform atrocity into acceptable military medicine. They did not yet understand that American prosecutors had spent months preparing to demolish every justification with the defendants' own meticulous documentation. The evidence against them was overwhelming because the Nazi regime had documented everything. German efficiency extended even to recording crimes. Medical reports described experiments in clinical language, listing subjects by number rather than name, recording deaths as data points rather than human tragedies. Photographs showed victims at various stages of torture, taken not to condemn, but to illustrate scientific findings. Letters between doctors discuss human subjects as laboratory animals, debating which concentration camp could supply the healthiest specimens for testing. The Americans had captured it all during the liberation of camps and the occupation of Germany. What the defendants failed to comprehend was that their scientific training, their medical credentials, and their careful documentation would not save them. Instead, These very things would condemn them more severely. The American prosecution understood that these were not ignorant men committing crimes in passion or panic. These were educated professionals who had systematically perverted medicine into an instrument of genocide. They had chosen to violate every principle of medical ethics, not from lack of knowledge, but from complete moral corruption. Their sophistication made their crimes more damning, not less. The courtroom gallery was filled with observers from around the world. American military officers sat alongside international journalists, legal scholars, and representatives from humanitarian organizations. But the most important observers were not visible in the courtroom. Survivors of the experiments, men and women who had endured hypothermia tanks, pressure chambers, sterilization procedures, and disease infections would soon take the witness stand. Their testimony, preserved through American translators and court reporters, would provide the human dimension to the documentary evidence. The defendants would be forced to confront not abstract subjects, but actual people whose suffering they had caused. As the first day of trial concluded, the defendants returned to their cells in the Nuremberg prison, a facility completely under American control. The conditions were clean, adequate, and far superior to those they had imposed on their victims. Guards provided regular meals, medical care, and access to legal counsel. This adherence to humane treatment, even for accused war criminals, represented a fundamental American principle. That justice required proper procedure, that conviction must be earned through evidence rather than coercion, that even monsters deserve fair trials. The contrast between American standards and Nazi practices will become a recurring theme throughout the proceedings. The 23 doctors facing trial at Nuremberg represented the culmination of a medical tradition that had once led the world. German medicine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had produced breakthroughs in bacteriology, pharmacology, and surgery that saved millions of lives worldwide. Robert Koch discovered the tuberculosis bacillus. Paul Ehrlich developed chemotherapy for infectious diseases. Wilhelm Röntgen discovered X-rays. German medical schools set global standards for research and clinical training. This proud legacy made the descent into Nazi medicine all the more shocking and incomprehensible. The transformation began long before Hitler seized power in 1933. German physicians had embraced eugenics and racial hygiene theories in the 1890s, arguing that society had a duty to improve the genetic quality of the population through selective breeding and sterilization of the unfit. These ideas gained academic respectability through journals, conferences, and university positions dedicated to racial science. When the Nazis came to power, they found a medical profession already predisposed to accept racial theories and willing to implement policies that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. The Law for Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, enacted July 1933, authorized compulsory sterilization of individuals deemed genetically inferior. Over 400,000 Germans were sterilized between 1934 and 1945. The medical profession not only complied with this law, but actively participated in its expansion. Doctors served on hereditary health courts that decided sterilization cases. They developed techniques to make the procedures more efficient. They published research justifying racial classifications and genetic categories that had no scientific basis. The medical establishment had become an instrument of Nazi ideology. The euthanasia program, code-named Action T4, represented the next step in medical corruption. Beginning in October 1939, Nazi doctors systematically murdered over 70,000 disabled children and adults in specially equipped facilities using gas chambers and lethal injections. Doctors selected victims, signed death certificates listing false causes of death, and advised families that their relatives had died from natural illness. This program established the infrastructure and personnel that would later operate the extermination camps. Medicine had been transformed from healing to killing, from protecting life to determining who deserved to live. Human experimentation in concentration camps began in 1941 and expanded throughout the war. The experiments were not random acts of sadism, but organized research projects approved by medical authorities and military officials. Dr. Sigmund Rascher conducted high-altitude experiments at Dachau, placing prisoners in decompression chambers that simulated conditions at 40,000 feet. Dozens died as their lungs ruptured and blood vessels exploded. Rasher meticulously documented each death, photographing victims and recording physiological responses. His reports were circulated among Luftwaffe medical officers who discussed his findings in academic seminars. Hypothermia experiments at Dachau subjected prisoners to freezing water tanks for hours, measuring how long they survived and testing various rewarming methods. Dr. Rasher personally supervised experiments that killed at least 90 prisoners. He reported his results to Heinrich Himmler and presented findings at conferences attended by senior military physicians. No one questioned the ethics of using prisoners as experimental subjects. No one objected to the methodology of freezing human beings to death. The medical profession had accepted that concentration camp prisoners existed outside the protection of medical ethics. Sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbruck concentration camp, conducted by Dr. Karl Gebhardt, deliberately infected Polish women with bacteria and dirt to simulate battlefield wounds, then tested various treatments. 74 women, later known as the Rabbits, were subjected to operations without anesthesia, had their legs mutilated and infected, and received inadequate treatment to test drug effectiveness. 15 died directly from the experiments, and dozens were permanently disabled. Gebhardt justified these experiments as necessary to develop better treatments for wounded German soldiers. He saw no moral problem with inflicting terrible suffering on prisoners to potentially benefit Wehrmacht troops. Sterilization experiments seeking efficient methods to render entire populations infertile were conducted at Auschwitz by Dr. Karl Klauberg and Dr. Horst Schumann. Thousands of Jewish women and men were subjected to surgical procedures, radiation exposure, and chemical injections designed to cause permanent sterility without surgery. Most victims died from complications or were murdered when no longer useful for research. The experiments had no legitimate scientific purpose beyond implementing Nazi plans for mass sterilization of conquered populations. Yet these doctors framed their work as medical research, published papers describing their methods, and sought professional advancement through their concentration camp work. The doctors who conducted these experiments shared several common characteristics that would prove crucial to their prosecution. First, they were highly educated professionals with legitimate medical training and credentials. Second, they documented their work extensively in medical language, treating human suffering as data to be recorded and analyzed. Third, they justified their actions through appeals to military necessity, scientific advancement, and service to the nation. Fourth, they expressed no remorse or recognition that they had violated fundamental ethical principles. They genuinely believed their medical expertise placed them beyond conventional moral judgment. This arrogance extended to their view of Allied medicine, particularly American medical ethics. Nazi doctors dismiss American concerns about informed consent and patient rights as sentimental weakness that hindered scientific progress. They viewed American medical research regulations as bureaucratic obstacles imposed by inferior democratic societies. German medicine, they believed, was superior precisely because it was freed from ethical constraints that limited experimentation. They could pursue knowledge wherever it led, unconstrained by concerns about individual suffering. This contempt for American medical values would make their confrontation with American justice all the more devastating. The defendants at Nuremberg represented the full spectrum of Nazi medical crimes. Some, like Karl Brandt, had held the highest positions in the medical hierarchy and bore responsibility for policy decisions that enabled all subsequent experiments. Others, like Siegfried Handlöser, had commanded military medical services that supplied concentration camps with equipment and personnel for experiments. Still others, like Waldemar Hoven, had personally murdered prisoners through direct injection or selection for gas chambers. Each defendant believed his particular role provided insulation from prosecution. Brigadier General Telford Taylor stood at the prosecution table, surrounded by a team of American lawyers, medical experts, and researchers who had spent 9 months preparing for this trial. Taylor, 48 years old, was a Harvard Law School graduate who had served as assistant prosecutor at the main Nuremberg trial of Nazi leaders. He understood that the doctors' trial required a different approach. These defendants would not claim they were following military orders or political directives. They would claim they were conducting legitimate medical research. Taylor needed to prove that their science was pseudoscience, that their experiments were torture, and that their medical credentials made their crimes more heinous, not less. The American prosecution team included 27 lawyers, most of them young attorneys who had interrupted promising careers to serve their country. James McCaney, 34 years old, specialized in medical evidence and spent months learning enough physiology to cross-examine doctors about their experimental protocols. Alexander Hardy focused on financial records, showing how Nazi doctors profited from concentration camp experiments through grants, promotions, and professional advancement. Leo Alexander, a neurologist who had emigrated from Germany in 1933, served as chief medical advisor, translating technical documents and explaining to the court how legitimate medical research should operate. Dr. Leo Alexander proved crucial to the prosecution strategy. As a physician who understood experimental methodology, he could explain to judges why the Nazi experiments lacked scientific validity, even apart from their ethical violations. Alexander had visited liberated concentration camps as part of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey medical team, interviewing survivors and documenting experimental facilities. He brought to court not just legal arguments, but medical authority that could challenge the defendants on their own professional ground. When Nazi doctors claimed military necessity justified their experiments, Alexander would demonstrate that the experiments produced no usable data and contributed nothing to medical knowledge. The preparation for trial revealed the extraordinary thoroughness of American evidence gathering. Teams of investigators had searched German medical facilities, universities, and government offices, seizing over 2,000 documents related to human experimentation. These included experimental protocols describing procedures in clinical detail, letters between doctors discussing subject selection and experimental methods, photographs documenting victims before and after experiments, and financial records showing how concentration camps were reimbursed for supplying human subjects. The Germans had documented everything, never imagining their records would become evidence in war crimes trials. American prosecutors developed a strategy to systematically destroy each defense that Nazi doctors might raise. If defendants claimed they conducted experiments to save German soldiers, prosecutors would present medical experts testifying that the experiments were scientifically worthless. If defendants argued that prisoners volunteered, prosecutors would present survivors who testified they were selected against their will. If defendants insisted their experiments followed international medical standards, prosecutors would present evidence of medical ethics codes prohibiting precisely what the defendants had done. Every justification would be met with overwhelming evidence of systematic criminality. The American approach to this trial reflected fundamental beliefs about justice and human dignity. The judges were all Americans, appointed specifically because the United States refused to compromise on procedural standards even for war crimes trials. The defendants received experienced German defense attorneys, paid by the American military government. They were allowed to call witnesses, cross-examine prosecution evidence, and present any defense they chose. The trials were conducted in both English and German with simultaneous translation, ensuring defendants understood every word spoken. This meticulous attention to fair procedure represented an American conviction that even the worst criminals deserved proper trials, because justice required legitimacy through process. The evidence presentation began with General Taylor calling Dr. Andrew Ivy, Vice President of the University of Illinois and one of America's leading medical researchers. Ivy testified about the standards governing legitimate human experimentation, explaining principles that had developed in American and international medical communities over decades. Experimental subjects must give informed consent. Experiments must be designed to minimize suffering. Potential benefits must outweigh risks. Researchers must stop experiments immediately if subjects show unexpected harm. These principles, Ivy testified, were not new ethical standards created after the war, but long-standing rules that any trained physician should know and follow. The contrast between Dr. Ivy's testimony about American medical ethics and the evidence of Nazi experiments proved devastating to the defense. Ivy described how American military medicine had developed treatments for hypothermia, high-altitude exposure, and infectious diseases through carefully designed experiments using animal models, volunteer subjects, and minimal risk protocols. American researchers had achieved genuine scientific advances while respecting human dignity. The Nazi experiments, by contrast, produced no useful knowledge because they were designed not to answer scientific questions, but to test human endurance under torture. They were pseudoscience disguised in medical language. The most powerful moments came when prosecutors presented testimony from survivors. The first survivor witness was a Polish woman named Jadwiga Dzido, age 32, who had been subjected to sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbruck. She entered the courtroom walking with difficulty, her right leg scarred and partially disabled from the experiment. Through an interpreter, she described being selected with other political prisoners, taken to an operating room, given inadequate anesthesia, and having her leg deliberately infected with bacteria and contaminated with wood shavings and glass fragments to simulate battlefield wounds. She received minimal treatment and suffered months of agony, while German doctors recorded her symptoms. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, the surgeon who had supervised Jadwiga's torture, sat in the defendant's dock taking notes, showing no visible emotion as she testified. When prosecutors asked Jadwiga to identify the doctor responsible, she pointed directly at Gebhardt. The courtroom was silent as American translators relayed her words to the judges. This woman, prosecutors emphasized, was not an experimental subject. She was a victim. The distinction mattered because it reframed the entire trial. The defendants wanted the court to see human experimentation as a medical practice that might have violated some rules. The Americans insisted the court see it as systematic torture and murder that could never be justified by scientific language. The documentary evidence proved equally damning. Prosecutors displayed photographs taken by Nazi doctors showing victims at various stages of experiments. One series showed prisoners in Dachau immersed in freezing water, their faces contorted in agony, their bodies turning blue from hypothermia. The photographs were labeled with precise times and temperatures, clinical notations that made the horror more grotesque rather than less. These were not clandestine photographs taken by liberators. These were official research documentation, proof that Nazi doctors viewed human suffering as data to be recorded and analyzed. American prosecutors introduced letters between Nazi doctors discussing human experiments with a casual tone of professional correspondence. One letter from Dr. Sigmund Rascher to Heinrich Himmler requested permission to use prisoners for high-altitude experiments, noting that previous animal studies had been inconclusive and that human subjects were necessary for definitive results. Himmler's reply authorized the experiments and offered to provide concentration camp prisoners. The correspondence revealed that human experimentation in Nazi Germany was not the work of rogue doctors, but an organized program with official approval at the highest levels of government and military authority. The turning point in the trial came during the testimony of Dr. Franz Blaha, a Czech physician who had been imprisoned at Dachau concentration camp from 1941 to 1945. Unlike the survivor witnesses who testified about experiments performed on them, Blaha had been forced to work as a prisoner doctor in the camp hospital, where he witnessed and was compelled to assist with numerous experiments and murders. His testimony provided an insider's view of how Nazi medical crimes were organized, who authorized them, and how doctors justified their actions to each other. Blaha described the arrival of Dr. Sigmund Rascher at Dachau in early 1942 to conduct high-altitude experiments. Rascher set up a decompression chamber in Block 5 of the camp, requisitioning prisoners from the camp administration for his research. Blaha was ordered to assist with the experiments, which involved placing prisoners in the chamber and rapidly reducing air pressure to simulate conditions at extremely high altitudes. Prisoners died in agony as their lungs ruptured and blood vessels burst. Rascher meticulously documented each death with photographs and physiological measurements, showing no concern for the suffering he was inflicting. More damning than the experiments themselves was Blaha's testimony about the casual conversations among Nazi doctors at Dachau. They discussed human subjects the way other researchers discuss laboratory animals, debating which concentration camp population would provide the best specimens for particular studies. They complained about administrative delays in receiving prisoners for experiments. They joked about squeamish guards who had trouble watching prisoners die. The testimony revealed that Nazi medical crimes were not committed by sadistic monsters, but by educated professionals who had so completely abandoned ethical constraints that they could torture and murder while maintaining the social conventions of academic research. The prosecution presented evidence that Nazi doctors had profited professionally from concentration camp experiments. Dr. Karl Gebhardt received promotions and prestigious appointments based partly on his Ravensbruck sulfanilamide research. Dr. Sigmund Rascher published articles about hypothermia experiments in German military medical journals, gaining recognition as an expert on cold weather survival. Dr. Kurt Blom received substantial research grants for biological warfare studies using concentration camp prisoners. These doctors were not sacrificing their careers for the greater good. They were advancing their careers through crimes, using prisoners as raw material for professional achievement. American investigators had discovered evidence that demolished the most common defense argument. Nazi doctors claimed their experiments were justified by military necessity, that wartime conditions required urgent development of treatments that could save German soldiers. Prosecutors introduced testimony from German military physicians who admitted that concentration camp experiments produced little useful information. The hypothermia studies at Dachau generated no data that improved treatment for pilots shot down over cold water. The high-altitude experiments contributed nothing to Luftwaffe aviation medicine. The sulfanilamide trials at Ravensbruck merely confirmed what was already known about infection treatment. The experiments had no legitimate scientific purpose beyond satisfying curiosity or ambitions of individual doctors. The prosecution presented evidence that legitimate medical research could have been conducted through ethical means. American medical researchers testified about wartime studies they conducted using volunteer subjects, careful protocols, and ethical review. The United States Navy had studied hypothermia by asking volunteers to sit in cold water for measured periods, with medical supervision and immediate termination if subjects showed distress. The experiments produced useful knowledge without torturing or killing anyone. The contrast demonstrated that Nazi doctors chose to use concentration camp prisoners not because ethical research was impossible, but because they simply did not care about their victims' suffering. One of the most revealing documents was a report from the German Medical Association Conference in October 1942, where Dr. Sigmund Rascher presented findings from his Dachau experiments to an audience of senior military physicians. The report described Rascher's presentation in detail, noting that he discussed using prisoners as experimental subjects without any physician in the audience objecting or questioning the ethics of his methods. The silence of the German medical profession, prosecutors argued, demonstrated that Nazi medical crimes were not aberrations but symptoms of moral collapse throughout German medicine. The defendants were being prosecuted not because they were exceptions but because they were emblematic. American prosecutors introduced evidence of financial transactions showing how concentration camps charge research institutions for supplying prisoners for experiments. Camp administrators sent invoices listing prisoners by number and experimental purpose, charging standard rates per subject. Universities and research institutes paid these invoices from grant funds, treating human beings as laboratory supplies to be ordered and billed like reagents or equipment. The bureaucratic documentation of human commodification shocked even hardened observers, revealing how thoroughly Nazi medicine had integrated murder into routine administrative procedures. The prosecution presented testimony from American soldiers who had liberated concentration camps and discovered experimental facilities. Sergeant Michael Walsh described entering Block 5 at Dachau in April 1945 and finding the decompression chamber still containing the body of a prisoner who had died in an experiment days before liberation. Walsh testified about discovering rooms filled with jars containing organs preserved in formaldehyde, each labeled with prisoner number and experimental notation. These were not war trophies or propaganda materials. These were scientific specimens collected by doctors who intended to publish research papers based on their concentration camp experiments. The most devastating evidence came from the defendants' own testimony. Under cross-examination by American prosecutors, several Nazi doctors admitted facts that destroyed their defenses. Dr. Karl Gebhardt acknowledged that the Polish women subjected to sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbruck never consented to participate and were not informed about the nature of the experiments or the risks involved. Dr. Karl Brandt admitted he had authority to stop unethical experiments, but chose not to exercise that authority. Dr. Siegfried Handlöser conceded that Wehrmacht medical regulations prohibited experiments on prisoners without consent, but he had never enforced those regulations in concentration camps. The decisive moment of the trial arrived on June 20th, 1947, during the closing arguments. Brigadier General Telford Taylor stood before the tribunal for the final time, addressing not just the 4 American judges, but history itself. The courtroom was packed with observers who understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. For the first time, an international tribunal was holding physicians criminally accountable for violating medical ethics. The outcome would determine whether doctors could hide behind scientific language and medical credentials when committing atrocities, or whether medicine would be subject to universal moral standards enforceable through law. Taylor began his closing statement by addressing the defendants' central argument that their experiments, however brutal, were justified by military necessity and the advancement of medical knowledge. He systematically demolished this defense by demonstrating that the experiments had produced no legitimate scientific knowledge and had not been necessary for any military purpose. The hypothermia experiments at Dachau generated data so poorly controlled and inconsistently recorded that no competent researcher could use them. The high-altitude studies violated basic experimental methodology by failing to control variables or use proper measurement techniques. The sulfanilamide trials at Ravensbruck merely confirmed what medical science already knew about wound infection treatment. More fundamentally, Taylor argued, the defendants had violated principles so basic to medical practice that no doctor could claim ignorance. The Hippocratic tradition, over 2,000 years old, required physicians to do no harm. Medical ethics codes adopted by professional associations worldwide prohibited experimentation on subjects without their consent. German medical regulations, still enforced during the Nazi period, forbade experiments that exposed subjects to serious risk without their voluntary agreement. The defendants knew these principles. They had been taught them in medical school. They had sworn oaths acknowledging them. Their violations were not mistakes or errors in judgment. They were deliberate crimes committed by educated professionals who chose to abandon their ethical obligations. Taylor pointed to the defendants seated before the court and reminded the judges that these were not ordinary criminals. These were doctors who had held positions of authority and respect. Dr. Karl Brandt had been Hitler's personal physician and a Reich commissioner. Dr. Siegfried Handlöser had commanded Wehrmacht medical services. Dr. Karl Gebhardt had been president of the German Red Cross. Their crimes were made worse, not excused, by their professional standing. They had betrayed not just their victims, but their profession, their oaths, and the trust that society places in physicians. Their punishment must reflect the magnitude of that betrayal. The American prosecution argued that the doctors' trial transcended individual accountability and addressed a fundamental question about the relationship between science and morality. Could scientific research ever justify the infliction of suffering on unconsenting subjects? The defendants argued yes, claiming that the pursuit of knowledge sometimes required sacrificing individual welfare for collective benefit. Taylor and his team argued no, insisting that science conducted without ethical constraints was not progress, but barbarism disguised in technical language. The tribunal's verdict would establish which philosophy would govern medicine in the post-war world. The judges deliberated for 79 days, a period reflecting the seriousness with which they approached their responsibility. The tribunal consisted of 4 American judges: Harold Sebring, a Florida Supreme Court justice who served as presiding judge; Walter Beals, a Washington Supreme Court justice; Johnson Crawford, a district court judge from Oklahoma; and Victor Swearingen, an assistant attorney general from Michigan. None had prior experience with war crimes trials. All had been selected precisely because they were experienced American jurists who would apply established legal principles to unprecedented crimes. Their task was not to create law from scratch, but to apply fundamental principles of criminal responsibility to defendants who happened to be physicians. On August 20th, 1947, the tribunal delivered its verdict. The courtroom was silent as Judge Sebring read the judgment, which ran over 60,000 words and addressed every argument the defense had raised. The tribunal found 16 defendants guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging: Karl Brandt, Karl Gebhardt, Joachim Rogowski, Waldemar Hoven, Wolfram Sievers, Victor Brack, and Rudolf Brandt. 5 received life imprisonment: Siegfried Handloser, Oskar Schroeder, Gerhard Rose, Karl Jensken, and Fritz Fischer, for received prison terms ranging from 10 to 20 years. 7 were acquitted for insufficient evidence of personal participation in crimes. The verdict shocked the defendants, most of whom had expected acquittal or minimal punishment. Dr. Karl Brandt, learning he would hang, maintained to the end that his work had been legitimate medical research conducted in wartime emergency. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who had personally supervised experiments that tortured and killed dozens of women at Ravensbruck, showed no remorse and insisted his experiments had been scientifically valuable. The arrogance and moral blindness that characterized Nazi medicine persisted even in the face of certain execution. These doctors could not comprehend that their professional credentials and scientific language could not excuse their crimes. The tribunal's judgment included a section that would prove more influential than the verdicts themselves. The judges, working with input from Dr. Leo Alexander and other medical advisors, articulated 10 principles that should govern all human experimentation. These principles, later known as the Nuremberg Code, established for the first time an international standard for medical research ethics. The first principle stated unequivocally, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This meant that no experiment could be conducted without informed consent from participants who understood the risks and were free to withdraw at any time. The remaining 9 principles of the Nuremberg Code addressed other essential safeguards. Experiments must be designed to yield socially beneficial results that cannot be obtained through other means. Experiments must be based on prior animal research and knowledge of disease progression. Experiments must avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering. No experiment should be conducted if there is reason to believe death or disabling injury will occur. Risks must never exceed the humanitarian. Importance of the problem being studied. Proper facilities and protections must be provided to protect subjects. Experiments must be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. Subjects must be free to terminate participation at any time. Researchers must be prepared to terminate experiments if continuation would likely result in injury or death. These 10 principles, drafted by American judges in response to Nazi medical crimes, became the foundation for modern medical ethics and human subjects research regulations worldwide. The code influenced the declaration of Helsinki adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, the Belmont Report that guides American research ethics, and national regulations governing clinical trials in every developed nation. Medical schools teach the Nuremberg Code as the watershed moment when medical ethics transitioned from professional norms to enforceable legal standards. What began as a response to Nazi atrocities became the framework protecting billions of people from research abuse. The executions of the 7 condemned doctors took place on June 2, 1948, at Landsberg Prison in Bavaria, under the supervision of American military authorities. The executions were conducted by hanging, the method specified by the Tribunal for War Criminals. Each condemned man was allowed to make a final statement. Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and the highest-ranking defendant, used his final words to insist that his medical research had been legitimate and that history would vindicate him. He showed no remorse for the victims of experiments he had authorized and no recognition that his actions violated fundamental moral principles. He died believing he was a martyr for science rather than a criminal who had perverted medicine into murder. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, the surgeon who had conducted sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbruck, maintained his arrogance to the end. In his final statement, he claimed his experiments had been necessary for military medical research, and that the women who suffered and died in his experiments were justified sacrifices for German soldiers. He expressed no sympathy for his victims and no understanding that informed consent was an absolute requirement for ethical research. His death ended a career that had transformed from healing to torture, from medical practice to war crimes. The Polish women he had mutilated, those who survived, learned of his execution with a mixture of relief and bitter recognition that no punishment could undo the suffering he had inflicted. The 5 doctors sentenced to life imprisonment, and the 4 receiving fixed terms began serving their sentences in Landsberg prison. The conditions were far superior to those their victims had endured in concentration camps. Prisoners received adequate food, medical care, exercise periods, and access to legal counsel. This humane treatment, even for convicted war criminals, reflected American principles of justice and human dignity. The United States insisted that proper treatment of prisoners was not a reward for good behavior, but a fundamental requirement of civilized society. The contrast between American standards and Nazi practices was deliberate, demonstrating that justice and mercy were not incompatible, but essential components of a moral legal system. The Nuremberg Code, articulated in the tribunal's judgment, began influencing medical practice and research regulations immediately. American military medical researchers, conducting studies on radiation exposure and chemical warfare defense in the late 1940s, were required to obtain informed consent from military volunteers based on Nuremberg principles. Pharmaceutical companies developing new drugs faced increasing pressure to document that clinical trial participants had consented to participation and understood potential risks. Medical journals began requiring authors to certify that research had been conducted ethically, with specific reference to Nuremberg standards for human subject protection. The impact of the doctor's trial extended beyond medical ethics to influence international law more broadly. The trial established that professionals could be held criminally accountable for violating ethical standards even when following orders or acting with government authorization. This principle, often called the Nuremberg Defense Prohibition, meant that doctors, lawyers, scientists, and other professionals could not escape responsibility for crimes by claiming they were simply doing their jobs or following instructions from superiors. Professional education and ethical training created obligations that superseded obedience to authority. This concept would prove crucial in subsequent war crimes prosecutions and professional ethics codes. Survivors of Nazi medical experiments began receiving recognition and support through programs established by Allied authorities and international humanitarian organizations. The women from Ravensbruck who had been subjected to sulfanilamide experiments, known as the rabbits, received medical treatment and compensation from the German government. Survivors of sterilization experiments at Auschwitz were located and provided with psychological counseling and financial assistance. Organizations dedicated to Holocaust documentation interviewed medical experiment survivors, preserving their testimonies for historical record and educational purposes. The victims, so long treated as experimental subjects rather than human beings, finally received acknowledgement of their suffering and affirmation of their dignity. The medical profession itself underwent examination and reform in response to revelations from the doctor's trial. Medical associations in the United States, Britain, and other Western nations adopted codes of ethics explicitly incorporating Nuremberg principles. Medical school curricula were revised to include mandatory instruction in research ethics and the history of medical abuses. Teaching hospitals established institutional review boards to evaluate proposed research involving human subjects. These reforms reflected recognition that professional self-regulation had failed catastrophically in Nazi Germany and that formal oversight mechanisms were necessary to prevent future abuses. The Nuremberg Code influenced the development of international human rights law beyond medical context. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in December 1948, reflected principles established at Nuremberg: that individuals possess inherent dignity that governments must respect, that consent is essential for any procedure affecting bodily integrity, and that scientific progress cannot justify violation of fundamental rights. The Declaration's prohibition on torture and inhumane treatment drew directly from evidence presented at the doctor's trial showing how easily professional language could disguise systematic cruelty. Education about Nazi medical crimes became mandatory in medical schools throughout the Western world. Students learned about the doctor's trial not as ancient history, but as a warning about how quickly professional ethics could collapse when physicians abandoned their fundamental obligations to patients. The case study from Nuremberg appeared in bioethics textbooks, research ethics seminars, and professional development courses. The message was clear: medical credentials and scientific training did not protect doctors from moral corruption. Vigilance, ethical reflection, and courage to resist unethical demands were essential professional obligations. The American judges who presided over the doctor's trial returned to civilian life, their service at Nuremberg becoming defining achievements in distinguished careers. Judge Harold Sebring returned to Florida Supreme Court and later reflected that the doctor's trial had been the most important work of his life, establishing principles that would protect countless people from research abuse. Judge Walter Beals resumed his position on the Washington Supreme Court and frequently spoke to medical and legal audiences about the lessons of Nuremberg. Their judicial legacy extended far beyond the specific verdicts to encompass the ethical framework they articulated for all future human experimentation. The prosecutors who built the case against Nazi doctors continued careers in law, medicine, and public service. Brigadier General Telford Taylor became a law professor at Columbia University and a prominent advocate for international justice. He argued that the doctor's trial demonstrated that professional ethics were not merely aspirational guidelines, but enforceable legal standards. Dr. Leo Alexander, the medical advisor whose expertise proved crucial to the prosecution, spent decades educating physicians about research ethics and warning against moral complacency. He insisted that the Nazi doctors were not monsters, but ordinary professionals who had lost their moral compass, making vigilance essential for all physicians. 79 years have passed since American judges delivered verdicts in the doctor's trial at Nuremberg. The physicians they condemned are long dead, executed, or imprisoned for crimes that shocked the conscience of humanity. But the principles established in that Nuremberg courtroom remain vibrantly alive, protecting billions of people from research abuse and defining the ethical boundaries that govern all human experimentation. The trial was not simply about punishing 23 Nazi doctors. It was about establishing that medicine operates under moral constraints that transcend national borders, political systems, and scientific ambitions. It was about affirming that human dignity is not negotiable, that consent is not optional, and that no advancement of knowledge justifies the infliction of suffering on unconsenting subjects. The contrast between Nazi medicine and American justice could not have been more profound. Nazi doctors had embraced a philosophy that elevated collective goals above individual rights, that treated human beings as raw materials for research, and that dismissed ethical constraints as obstacles to scientific progress. They believed their medical expertise placed them beyond moral judgment, that their contributions to knowledge justified any means necessary to obtain it. They documented their crimes meticulously, never imagining that their clinical notes and research photographs would become evidence of systematic atrocity. Their arrogance was so complete that even facing execution, many could not comprehend how their actions violated fundamental principles of human decency. American justice represented something entirely different. The prosecutor, judges, and medical advisors who tried the Nazi doctors insisted that medicine could never be separated from morality, that scientific language could not disguise torture, and that professional credentials did not excuse crimes. They demonstrated through painstaking documentation and compelling testimony that Nazi medical experiments had violated principles known to every trained physician: the Hippocratic tradition of doing no harm, the requirement of informed consent, the obligation to minimize suffering, and the duty to terminate experiments that caused unexpected harm. These were not new standards created after the war to criminalize previously acceptable conduct. They were long-standing ethical requirements that Nazi doctors had deliberately violated. The Nuremberg Code, born from this trial, became the founding document of modern medical ethics. Its 10 principles established standards that had existed informally in medical practice, but had never been codified in enforceable legal terms. The Code's first principle, requiring voluntary informed consent from all research subjects, represented a fundamental shift in how medicine approached human experimentation. Before Nuremberg, consent was considered desirable but not always essential, particularly when subjects were prisoners, psychiatric patients, or members of marginalized groups. After Nuremberg, consent became an absolute requirement. No research could proceed without it. No scientific objective could justify experimenting on people who had not agreed to participate. The Code's remaining principles addressed other essential protections. Experiments must be scientifically sound and socially valuable. Risks must be proportionate to benefits. Subjects must be free to withdraw. Researchers must terminate experiments that cause unexpected harm. These principles seem obvious now, but they were revolutionary in 1947. They established that protecting research subjects was not merely a matter of individual researcher conscience, but legal requirement enforceable through criminal prosecution. They created a framework that has been elaborated and refined over decades but never fundamentally changed. The Nuremberg Code remains a foundation on which all subsequent research ethics regulations have been built. The influence of American action at Nuremberg extended far beyond medical ethics. The trial established that professionals in all fields carry ethical obligations that supersede obedience to authority or loyalty to employers. Lawyers, engineers, scientists, and other educated professionals cannot escape responsibility for crimes by claiming they were following orders or doing their jobs. Professional training creates moral obligations, and violation of those obligations can result in criminal prosecution. This principle, established most clearly in the Doctors Trial, has influenced every subsequent war crimes prosecution and shaped professional ethics codes worldwide. The survivors of Nazi medical experiments, so long treated as experimental subjects rather than human beings, finally received recognition of their suffering and affirmation of their dignity through the trial. Witnesses like Jadwiga Dzido, who testified about sulfanilamide experiments at Ravensbruck, transformed from victims into advocates, ensuring the world understood what had been done and why it must never happen again. Their testimony proved more powerful than documentary evidence because it reminded the court that statistics represented people, that experimental subjects had names and families and futures that had been destroyed by Nazi doctors. The American prosecution insisted on humanizing the victims, refusing to let them be reduced to data points or case numbers. The medical profession itself underwent profound change in response to Nuremberg revelations. Medical associations adopted formal ethics codes incorporating Nuremberg principles. Medical schools revised curricula to include mandatory instruction in research ethics and the history of medical abuses. Teaching hospitals established institutional review boards to evaluate proposed research involving human subjects, ensuring that experiments met ethical standards before beginning. Pharmaceutical companies developed strict protocols for clinical trials, documenting informed consent and monitoring subject welfare. These reforms reflected recognition that professional self-regulation had failed catastrophically in Nazi Germany and that formal oversight mechanisms were necessary to prevent future abuses. The American insistence on procedural justice during the trial, even for accused war criminals, demonstrated a fundamental principle, that the legitimacy of justice depends on the fairness of procedure. The Nazi doctors received experienced defense attorneys paid by the American military government. They were allowed to present any defense they chose, to call witnesses on their behalf, and to cross-examine prosecution evidence. The trial was conducted with meticulous attention to legal standards, ensuring that convictions resulted from overwhelming evidence rather than victor's vengeance. This commitment to fair trials, even for defendants accused of heinous crimes, represented an American conviction that justice must be earned through proper procedure, not assumed through superior power. The legacy of the Doctors Trial continues to shape medical practice and research ethics today. Every clinical trial conducted anywhere in the world operates under principles established at Nuremberg. Every institutional review board evaluating research proposals applies standards derived from the Nuremberg Code. Every medical student learning about research ethics studies the Nazi medical experiments as warnings about how easily professional ethics can collapse when physicians abandon their fundamental obligations. The trial remains relevant not as ancient history, but as a continuing reminder that vigilance, ethical reflection, and courage to resist unethical demands are essential professional obligations. The broader lesson of Nuremberg extends beyond medicine to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between power and morality. The Nazi doctors believed that their scientific expertise and medical credentials placed them beyond conventional moral judgment, that their pursuit of knowledge justified any means necessary to obtain it. American justice insisted that no one stands above moral law, that professional training creates obligations rather than exemptions, and that the most educated and sophisticated criminals deserve the harshest punishment precisely because they should have known better. This principle remains essential to any society that values both expertise and ethics, that seeks to advance knowledge while respecting human dignity. The contrast between how Nazi Germany treated concentration camp prisoners and how American authorities treated even convicted war criminals demonstrated a fundamental philosophical difference. The Nazis had built a system predicated on the belief that some human beings possess no inherent dignity, that prisoners existed solely as instruments for achieving collective goals. The Americans insisted that all human beings possess inherent worth that no circumstance can erase, that even the worst criminals deserve humane treatment and fair trials. This difference was not merely rhetorical but practical, reflected in every aspect of how the Nuremberg trials were conducted and how convicted war criminals were imprisoned. 8 decades after the trial, survivors of Nazi medical experiments gather annually to commemorate their liberation and honor those who did not survive. These gatherings are attended by descendants of American soldiers who liberated concentration camps, prosecutors who built cases against Nazi doctors, and medical professionals who dedicated their careers to ensuring such atrocities never recur. The survivors speak not only of their suffering, but of the American judges and prosecutors who gave them voice, who insisted their testimony mattered, who affirmed their humanity when Nazi doctors had tried to erase it. They described the trial not as vengeance, but as restoration, the moment when the world acknowledged what had been done and promised never to allow it again. The final words belong to those who witnessed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human justice. Dr. Leo Alexander, the medical advisor whose expertise proved crucial to the prosecution, spent decades after the trial warning against moral complacency. He insisted that the Nazi doctors were not monsters, but ordinary professionals who had lost their moral compass, making vigilance essential for all physicians. In his last interview before his death in 1985, Alexander was asked what lesson he hoped future generations would take from Nuremberg. He paused, then replied with words that still resonate. The Nazi doctors proved that education without ethics creates sophisticated criminals rather than enlightened professionals. The American judges proved that justice requires not just punishing crimes, but establishing principles that prevent future atrocities. Both lessons remain essential. We must remember not just what the Nazis did, but what the Americans created in response. The Nuremberg Code is not just a historical document. It is a living promise that human dignity will be protected, that consent cannot be coerced, and that medicine will serve humanity rather than dominate it. This is the enduring legacy of the Doctors Trial. Not just 7 hangings and 9 imprisonments, but fundamental reordering of the relationship between medicine and morality. American justice did not simply punish Nazi doctors. It established principles that have protected billions of people from research abuse, that have guided medical ethics for 8 decades, and that will continue shaping how medicine operates for generations to come. The 23 defendants who entered courtroom 600 in December 1946 expected their medical credentials would shield them from accountability. They discovered that American justice held doctors to higher standards, not lower ones. They learned that betraying the trust inherent in medical practice earned not sympathy but condemnation. They found that no scientific language could disguise torture, no professional credentials could excuse crimes, and no appeal to collective benefit could justify individual suffering inflicted without consent. These lessons, established by American prosecutors and judges in the Nuremberg courtroom, remain as vital today as they were 79 years ago. They remind us that the strongest societies are those that combine advancement of knowledge with protection of dignity, that pursue scientific progress within ethical boundaries, and that understand true power lies not in the ability to dominate but in the commitment to justice.